And what I want to do is to give a shir on the parsha, but actually what I want to do is to give you an kind of overview of the book of Bamidbar. And I'll start by saying they kept on telling me over and over again, this is a very high-level shiur. So I said, we'll put it to the test because I'm only giving you sources in Hebrew. So we'll see if this is really a very high-level shiur. But in any case, I will translate whatever we have. So for those of you whose Hebrew is not so good, we will get along together. Okay, now, the title of my shir was Bamidbar or Numbers. And I'm sure all of you are familiar with that. When you look at the way the book is referred to in the Hebrew, we call it Bamidbar. But on the other hand, Numbers is not the translation of Bamidbar. And then the question is, where does Numbers come from? So,
a lot of numbers, right?
What?
There's a lot of numbers.
A lot of numbers, right? It makes a lot of sense. Okay, but the question, who gave it that title? And in fact, right, so you say Christians, that would be the natural assumption, except that, in fact, the title of Numbers comes from the Gemara, and we're going to actually see that in a few minutes. But now the question is, what's in a name? What difference does it make what you call the book? Now, the simple thing is to say, well, it's just an easy way you take something, a word that appears in the beginning, and then you stick it on and use that as the label. But in fact, both in terms of the books of the Chumash, and I would say also in terms of the Parshiyot, it wasn't that they just picked a name, because that's the first word that appears, but it actually says something about the nature of the parsha or of the book. And that's what I want to look at right now. So without any further ado, so the first thing to point out is does everybody have a Chumash? Sure. Because we're going to be going back and forth besides the sheet that I gave out. So if you look at the opening pasuk that you have, this is Bamidbar, Perek Aleph, pasuk Aleph. It says, "Vaydaber Hashem Moshe b'Midbar Sinai." God speaks to Moshe in Midbar Sinai. So obviously, right, it says Midbar, so therefore we call it Bamidbar. But there's actually a problem on a certain level, because if you look at the end of last week's parsha, right, the very last pasuk, in Sefer Vayikra, it says, Eila ha-mitzvot, asher tziva Hashem et Moshe el b'nei Yisrael, b'Har Sinai. So it talks about Har Sinai. And I'm sure all of you are familiar with that. One of the Parshiyot last week was Parshat Bahar. And Ma Inyan Shmita Etzel Har Sinai. So we'll talk about that actually. But what I want you to see is the Jewish people right now are located in Har Sinai. Yet the book starts out by saying they're B'Midbar Sinai. Now it's true, Har Sinai is a Midbar Sinai. But the point is, the fact that we don't say Har Sinai, and the fact that we say B'Midbar Sinai, is because what you want to say is we're starting a new chapter. And in fact, at the end of Vayikra, we're essentially ending the chapter, if you will, of Har Sinai, which began in chapter 19 in the book of Shemot, when the Jewish people come, right, as we all know, Rosh Chodesh Sivan, okay, and we've ended that chapter in the end of Sefer Vayikra. Now we're beginning something new, which is Bamidbar Sinai. And even though the Jews haven't moved anywhere, but on a conceptual level, it's a completely different idea. And what do I mean by that? If I had to ask you, what characterized the period that the Jewish people were at Har Sinai? If you had to summarize it, what was significant about that period? So what would you say? What? One at a time.
Matan Torah.
Matan Torah. Okay. Very timely. Anything else? They built the Mishkan, which is true, and we're going to be talking about that in quite a bit as we go on.
They were gathered together in a specific order.
Now that's in this week's, well, they were, but this week this Parsha, you highlighted it. We're going to be talking about that. But what I would say, and that's really relevant to the end of Vayikra, The essence of Har Sinai is that we entered into what would be called a covenantal relationship with God. There was a Brit. Okay, now we tend to focus on the revelation at Sinai. But in fact, perhaps what's even more important is the fact that we entered into a covenant. We took upon ourselves the Torah that was crystallized in last week's parsha with the blessings and the curses, which means that at Har Sinai, that's when we now became the people of the book, the people of the covenant. Okay? And that finished at the end, on a certain level, at the end of last week's parsha. Now we're doing Bamidbar. So what is Bamidbar? Now we talk about Bamidbar, literally means in the desert. Okay, and what's significant about the Jewish people being in the desert as a new chapter? But it's not exactly a new chapter because they've been in the desert. So what will you say?
Off to Israel.
What?
They're off to the land of Israel.
They're off to the land of Israel, absolutely. Which means that on a certain level, being in the desert, in and of itself, is not significant. It's a transition. We're on the way. So it's as if we have, on the one hand, Har Sinai, which is where we receive the Torah, we entered it into the covenant. We have Eretz Yisrael, which is the destination. And in the meantime, we have the desert. So that to a great extent, the book of Bamidbar is really looking at a transition. So now, if you look at the sheet that I gave, the first reference which I have is the introduction of the Ramban to the book of Bamidbar. And there are quite a few commentaries who have introductions to the books of the Chumash. Among my favorites are the Ramban and the Netziv, both of whom I have over here. So I want to start with the Ramban. And I want to look not at the beginning part, but at the last part. You see the second paragraph where it says, HaSefer Hazeh. Everybody have it? It says, VaHaSefer Hazeh, and this book, Kulo b'mitzvot sha'ah. Mitzvot sha'ah, temporary mitzvot. Mitzvot that are not forever, that are only for the moment. Shenitztavu bahem ba'amdam bamidbar, which they were commanded while they were in the desert. Uvenisim hana'asim lahem, and also the miracles which were done to them. L'saper kol ma'aseh hagadol asher asa imahem lahafli. To now tell the great things which God did for the Jewish people that was wondrous. And then he says, Yisaper, and it also tells, Ki hechel latet oivem lefneim lecharach, that God gave over the enemies of the Jewish people to them by the sword. V'tzivan, God commanded, Ech techalek ha'aretz lahem, how the land should be distributed, divided up. And then he said, Ve'em b'sefer hazeh mitzvot nohagot l'dorot. You don't have any mitzvot which are for generations, forever. Zulati tzat mitzvot, except for a few. Okay? So now, so if you look at it, if you look what the Ramban is saying, it's like he's kind of trying to summarize certain things. So he's saying, so what do you have over here? Essentially what you have is things which are just for the moment, right, which are relevant to the Jewish people when they're in the desert. And we also have about the miracles which God did, it wants to tell us. And we also have about how the Jewish people are beginning, you might say, to take possession of the land of Israel. They're defeating their enemies, which is chapter 21 with Sichon and Og. And then you have, okay, how the land is going to be distributed, which appears later on. So he kind of lumps together a whole bunch of things. Now, if I had to take this Ramban, so from my perspective, the Ramban is actually looking at this book as the book of the desert. And because it's the book of the desert, which is where the Jewish people are supposed to be temporarily, so therefore what we're doing is now giving you a description of what's relevant to the desert, which are mitzvot, which are for that moment. We're also talking about things, and as we said, since the Jewish people are on their way to the land of Israel, things which will be relevant to the land of Israel, which is the borders of the land of Israel, which he doesn't mention, but is in the end of Bamidbar, which is how the land is going to be divided up, and also the initial battles which the Jewish people have on the eastern side of the Jordan, which is foreshadowing what's going to happen when they go on the other side of the Jordan River. So essentially, Bamidbar is setting the stage for what's going to be happening later on. Okay? So far, everybody's with me? Okay, now, I want to point out that if you take everything I've said till now, it then is also very, very interesting if you take this idea and see how it already began in a way when the Jewish people leave Egypt. And this is actually the Torah reading that we have on Shavuot. Right? What's the Torah reading on Shavuot? Yitro. So I made a mistake. This is a trick question. It's not the Torah reading of Shavuot, but actually of the seventh day of Pesach, which is Parshat B'Shalach. And how does Parshat B'Shalach start out? Vayhi b'shalach paro et ha'am v'lo nacham Elokim derech eretz plishtim ki karovu ki amar Elokim pen yinachem ha'am birotam milchama v'shavu Mitzrayma. God didn't take the Jewish people out of Egypt directly into the land of Israel. Why? Because God is afraid if they go directly in, they'll immediately encounter warfare. And as a result, what God said is, so in order for the Jewish people to not encounter warfare, in order to not be demoralized, in order to not decide to go back to Egypt, I'm going to take them roundabout. Where am I taking them? In the desert. So actually the story of the Jewish people begins in the desert, in Parshat B'Shalach. And in fact, what seems to be from there is that somehow we need them to be in the desert to prepare them in order to be able to come into the land of Israel, in order to be able to actually engage in warfare. But before they engage in warfare, okay, they have to have this period in the desert. Now, if I were teaching you Parshat B'Shalach, so what I would tell you is that the desert for the Jewish people is an outdoor Beit Midrash. And what do I mean by that? It's a learning experience. What's the learning experience which the Jewish people have in the desert? And the Ramban actually said this. What?
Various events which are connected to mitzvot that we need to keep. To get it, basically, I to make Am Yisrael into Am Yisrael, not into just a crowd of ex-slaves.
Well, we actually began the process of making them Am Yisrael in Egypt, but you're right, we make them Am Yisrael at Mount Sinai in terms of the covenant, but what we're actually doing in the desert, and that's, you see this in Parshat B'Shalach, and the Ramban talks about it in what we read a moment ago. The Jewish people experience the miracles of God. By experiencing the miracles of God, that is supposed to put in them this faith in God. The faith in God is which will in the end enable them to then go on and to fight their enemies and not to be overwhelmed by them. Now you might also add, right, to throw into the hopper, that the Jewish people also have to know what they're fighting for, which is Har Sinai. And then if you want to throw in another thing, the Rambam says, in the Guide to the Perplexed, that the Jewish people need to be in the desert because they have this, what we would call Spartan existence. And when you live a Spartan existence, you become tough. And when you become tough, then you can be a soldier. That's the Rambam. Yes?
Why do you need that whole time period for them to have faith in Hashem and be prepared for warfare? As soon as they came out of Mitzrayim and they had the Yam Suf, it demonstrated that Hashem took care of them with their enemies, and it already said, "By Meir Hashem, Moshe Avram."
Okay. Excellent question, no? And what's an excellent answer?
Golden calf.
Golden calf. You don't even need to get to the golden calf. What happens as soon as they leave the Red Sea? Mara. 3 days they go in the desert, no water, everybody's fetching. And so what do you see? So you see that from there, that yes, for one moment the Jewish people believed in God, but they evidently needed to have something that's going to sustain that belief on a day-to-day basis, which by the way is what? What was given to them actually? The man. So this is what's going to sustain their faith, which means that if the Jewish people are going to actually have that faith in God, it's not enough to just have a one-time experience. They have to be experiencing it on an ongoing level, and maybe that, when they get into a certain schwung, as they say, that will be able to then enable them to go and fight their enemies. Now, I just want to point out one thing, that so if I now come back to our parsha, how does our parsha begin? With a census. Okay, in fact, in our parsha you have 3 censuses, and we're going to talk about it. But the first census in the parsha is all the men above the age of 20.
Except for Levium.
Absolutely, except for the Levium. All the regular Jewish population above the age of 20, who are referred to as Yotzei Tzava. And I'll ask you, what does Yotzei Tzava mean? Soldiers. Okay, we'll talk about this more in a minute. But for the moment, soldiers. So, the Rashbam, if you look at number 4 on the sheet that I gave you, when it says in the census, Se'u et rosh kol adat b'nei Yisrael, so the Rashbam says, Lefi shemei ata tzrichim lalechet la'eretz Yisrael. Since now we need to come to the land of Israel, right? Because the Jewish people are now ready to go. U'bnei esrim ru'uyim latzeit b'tzva ha'milchama, and those above the age of 20 are fit to go and fight. So then I'll just skip. He says, "Sharei b'esrim b'chodesh hashini hazeh na'ala hanan, lachein tziva hakadosh baruch hu b'tchilat chodesh zeh limanotan." Therefore, God commanded to count them, which means that according to the Rashbam, what is happening right now? Bamidbar, the Jewish people are now getting themselves ready to go to the land of Israel. But if you want to go to the land of Israel, you're going to have to conquer the land of Israel, which means you have to have an army. And if I want to have an army, so then I have to do a call-up. Who am I calling up? All the men above the age of 20. So everybody who's being counted are, in effect, the ones who are going to be the soldiers to conquer the land of Israel.
40 years later, the ones who don't make it.
Oh, wait a second. Now, besides that, if you look at the second chapter of Bamidbar, anybody know what's in the second chapter? What?
Counting with the location of the flags around.
Well, it's counting, but it's essentially arranging them, structuring the camp. So now, if I take what the Rashbam is saying, you could say, so first thing I do is I simply call everybody up, count how many I have. The next thing that I do is I have to organize them, structure them, and I group them, right? Groups of 3 tribes, each one on a different side. You might even say, the Rashbam doesn't say this, okay, that how are they organized? Well, they're organized 3 tribes on each side. What's in the middle? The Mishkan. Why is the Mishkan in the middle? What? Protecting it. And so therefore the Rashbam will say, how do we organize our camp? We want to make sure that the thing which is the most precious in our midst, we now have protected. So we put everybody around so that there's no way that it can be attacked from any side. Now, I just want to take this point and say, so therefore, one approach which would seem to emerge from what I just read in the Ramban, called the book Bamidbar. What is Bamidbar? We're now about to make the transition from Mount Sinai to the land of Israel. To make that transition, we have to get ourselves ready for warfare. We have to take a census. We have to then also organize the camp. Not only that, but if I jump ahead a moment, so then when I go to the end of Bamidbar, which the Ramban also says, then we talk about how the Jews actually did engage in warfare on the eastern side of the Jordan, which was the beginning of the process of taking possession of the land of Israel. We talk about how the land of Israel is supposed to be distributed. So therefore, the book of Bamidbar is simply this transition period from Mount Sinai to the land of Israel. Now, everybody knows that transition periods should theoretically be very, very short. But as everybody knows, a lot of times people who are in transit, the transit becomes permanent on a certain level. And the fact is that the Jewish people theoretically, right from the beginning of the book of Bamidbar, could have come into the land of Israel within a few months, okay, till they got organized and everything else. Instead of a few months, it ended up being 40 years or 38 years later. Which means that, and why did that happen? What? Well, you have the Chet HaMeraglim, but not only, as we're going to talk about in a moment, you have a whole series of sins, one after the other, in rapid succession, which means that, and now to go back, H, to what you said, which means that evidently the Jewish people needed more of a learning experience, so maybe they need the desert more, because they haven't yet gotten the point, because if they keep on fetching and complaining, and not only that, but with the Meraglim, it reaches its climax. And in fact, I just want to say one pasuk, which is by the Meraglim, which I think is like the essence of the story of the Meraglim. V'anihi ve'einenu kachagavim v'chein hayinu be'eineihem, which means we saw ourselves as being grasshoppers, and so we were in their eyes. But the problem of the Jewish people is, you see yourself as a grasshopper. You see yourself as being overwhelmed. So maybe you need to spend more time in the desert to build up your confidence and to feel that in the end, right, you can do it, as Kalev said, Alo nalev yarashnota. So that's looking at it from the perspective of the book of Bamidbar, the desert. Why the desert is significant. But then there's another way of looking at it. Yes?
Also that Hashem thought that this generation of former slaves will never make it, so he had to raise up a new generation in freedom.
Okay. What Hashem saw, okay, I'm not, but what you're saying is true. In other words, we can say, in retrospect, that evidently this generation was incapable of breaking out of slavery. We have to have a new generation that grew up in the desert. I agree with that 100%. And you can already see that in Parshat B'Shalach. There's a midrash which says, V'chamushim alu b'nei Yisrael me'eretz, that only a fifth of the population actually left Egypt, because the assumption was 4/5 would never make it out. And even the fifth that supposedly made it out, who theoretically should have been able to rise to the occasion, which they actually did at the splitting of the Red Sea, which they did at Har Sinai, but evidently they couldn't sustain it, right? In today's terms, we probably say they were probably traumatized by their experience of slavery, so that they could never go beyond it. But in any case, that's Bamidbar. Now what I want to do is talk about...
Moshe couldn't come into the land?
We're going to talk about that in a moment. Okay? It's going to touch on what we're about to talk about. So now we have numbers. So now, numbers because we have a census. But, in fact, in this week's Parsha, there are 3 censuses. Chapter 1, census of the general Jewish population above the age of 20, who are going to be Yotzei Tzava. Then you have chapter 3, and then subsequently chapter 4. Chapter 3 and 4 are 2 other censuses, both of which are related to whom? Leviim. But the first census of the Leviim, for above the age of 1 month. Okay? By the way, does anybody know how many they were? 22,000. Okay, I just want to point out that the Levi'im were disproportionately fewer than the general Jewish population. Right? If you actually go through the numbers, you'll see that the general Jewish population, the lowest numbers were around 30 plus thousand for 20 and above. The Levi'im are 22,000 for 1 month and above. The second census is of the Levi'im between the ages of 30 and 50 who work in the Mishkan. And there, if anybody knows, you know what the numbers were? 8,680. But in any case, if you then make a calculation, which approximate, add another 50%, gives you 12,000, which means the Levim above the age of 20 were probably 12,000, but the general Jewish population is minimally triple and maximally 6 times that amount, which therefore means that the Levi'im are, relatively speaking, a very small fraction of the population. Or to put it in different language, the Levi'im, right, are approximately 2% of the male population. So the fact that they're not going to fight is not exactly a big deal. Okay, that's parenthetically. Okay, in any case, the, yes, anybody had? Okay, so now, but in our Parsha we have 3 censuses. Now, I want to point out, later on in Bamidbar, you have another 2 censuses, which really is 1. Anybody know where? Pinchas. In chapter 26, you have another census. What's the difference between what we have now and what we have later on?
For the distribution of the land. How they're going to distribute the land.
That census is for the distribution of the land. That census is of the people who are coming into the land of Israel. Our census is of those who left Egypt, which means, as was mentioned earlier, that you have a whole generation that died in the desert. We have a new generation that's grown up. So therefore, what we have by us, the ones who left Egypt, and for the moment, here we are taking a census of the ones who are about to be going into war. Over there, we have a census of the ones who are coming into the land of Israel, who are going to be getting a portion of the land of Israel. And we have to know how many to determine what exactly will be the size of each tribe. Okay, given that, so now I want to look at the introduction of the Netziv to the book of Bamidbar. And if you look on the number 2, so the Netziv says, Zeh HaSefer Nikra b'Mishnah Yoma. This book is called in the Mishnah in Masechet Yoma. Uvefi Tana Rabbi Chanin ben Gamliel b'Sotah. It appears also in Masechet Sotah. Chumash HaPkudim, which means he quotes you 2 places in the Talmud where the rabbis refer to the book of Bamidbar as Sefer Pkudim. Okay, and then the one that appears in Masechet Yoma, for those of you who are familiar, the Kohen Gadol would read from the Torah the sections about Yom Kippur on Yom Kippur, and there is where it says, and one of the sections he reads is from the book of Bamidbar, because it tells you the offerings that are brought. So there it refers to this book as Sefer Pkudim. And then he says, V'chein katab bahag bal halachot gedolot. So now he says the following, V'nirsham b'dat rabotenu, right? It's recorded in the mindset of our rabbis, inyan shnei hapkudim shebazeh hasefer, the matter of the 2 censuses, which when he says 2 censuses, is referring to the beginning of the Parsha and Parshat Pinchas. So in their minds, he says, this is noted. Mishar dvarim shemiyuchadim b'zeh hasefer. He says that it seems the rabbis are focusing on the censuses more than anything else that appears in this book. Kamo, for example, Hameraglim, the story of the spies, Birkat Bil'am, Va'od harbe. And so essentially what he's bothered by is, Why do the rabbis refer to the book as Numbers when there's so many other things in the book that you might talk about that you would assume might be even more significant? What's in a number? And now look at what he says. Mishum de ikar zeh sefer, because the essence of this book, hamachlif, which is the transferal, mishaneh, the change, halichot im Hashem b'chayei ha'olam, me'az shehigiu l'Eretz Yisrael, in the way God relates to the world from the time they enter the land of Israel, min haderech shehalchu Bamidbar, from the way God related when they were in the desert. Shebamidbar hayu mitnagim b'midat tiferet, in the desert they were being led with the attribute of glory. Shehalach liyamim Moshe, that went to the right of Moshe. Shehu legamrei, which is completely lemala mehalichot hateva, above the way nature operates. Uve'eretz Yisrael halchu b'derech hateva, and in the land of Israel they went by the way of nature. B'sitrei hashgachat malchut shamayim baruchu, in the hiddenness of the providence of the kingdom of heaven, blessed be He. Which means, what the Nitziv is saying is, the two censuses are related to two different ways in which God relates to the world. It's related to the two different generations that were counted. The one that left Egypt, the one that entered the land of Israel. And it's related to the two different types of realities, the desert reality and the land of Israel reality. What's the difference? In the desert, how does God behave? Nisim gluyim, right? Clear miracles, right? God is transcendent, things that are completely beyond the natural reality. God is, and I will add to that, visible. You see something, you say, that must be God. On the other hand, when you come into the land of Israel, God is behaving in a hidden manner, working through the natural order. And he said that this change, this shift from how God behaved in the desert to how God behaved in the land of Israel is reflected in the censuses. And that's the reason why the rabbis put such an emphasis on the census, because by looking at the census, it reflects two different realities. And let me just skip for a second. Okay? Look, you see where it's underlined, right? The next few lines down where it's underlined. Ve'alzeh shinui hamitzuyam b'zeh sefer. And regarding this change, the shift, which is noted in the book, Amru Chazal b'Breshit, and this is fascinating. Vayavdel Elokim bein ha'or levein ha'choshech. God made the separation between light and darkness. Zeh Sefer Bamidbar. This is the book of Bamidbar. Shehu mavdil ben yotzei Mitzrayim uvein ba'ei ha'aretz, which is now differentiating between those that left Egypt and those that left and entered the land of Israel. Oh, so this then is fascinating. Who is the light? Who are the sons of light? Those who left Egypt. Who are the sons of darkness? Those that came into the land of Israel. And you're laughing, why?
Because it's anti the aim of coming to Eretz Israel is the light to the nations. Well,
so that's number one. And number two, you would have assumed it should be exactly the opposite, because the people who left Egypt, what did we just say a few moments ago? They have a slave mentality. Because they have a slave mentality, a whole generation died in the desert. So that should be the sons of darkness. The people, the generation that grew up in the desert, presumably they are able to deal with coming into the land of Israel, and they are actually faithful to God, so they should be the sons of light. So the Netziv was a smart guy, he knew that too. So, but why is he calling, or the Midrash, it's not the Netziv, it's the Midrash. Why is the Midrash saying it the other way around? Because
Hashem was open in the desert and he was hidden.
exactly. So it has nothing to do with the nature of the people, it has to do with God. In the desert, God is visible. It's like the light. You see it, it's in your face. They're the sons who experience light. And the ones who come to the desert, into the land of Israel, they're the ones where God is hidden. So that's why it's as if they're living in a reality which is dark. And therefore, this is now coming to highlight the movement from reality A to reality B. And that's reflected in the censuses. And that's why the censuses are so important. So I still have time, so I can, I always usually get pressured at the end. So now I want to look at this idea of, the generation of light. This idea of how God is now doing things in a supernatural way, and that's the beginning of Bamidbar, and what's the significance of that, and how it's reflected in the census. So, let's just look at the Chumash for 1 second, in the beginning of the parsha. This is Parak Aleph, Pasuk Bet. It says, Su'u et rosh kol adat b'nei Yisrael, l'mishpechotam levet avotam, b'mispar shemot, kol zachar legulgalotam. And then Gimel says, Mi ben esrim shana v'mala, kol yotzei tzava b'Yisrael, tifkidu otam letzivotam, ata v'aron. Now in these two psukim, we actually have 3 words that are related to counting. First one, or 3 expressions. Se'u et rosh, which literally means lift up the head, but it's a way of acknowledging, right, and of counting. Then we have, second one, b'mispar shemot, with according to the number of names, which is, by the way, interesting. You don't just say the number, you say names. And the third one is tifkedu otam, which is pikudim. So 3 different words. Now, I'm sure that, right, for the people whose Hebrew is very good, I'm sure you will never go anywhere and want to use the word number and say pikudim. If you ever want to say in Hebrew number, what's the term you'll use? Mispar. Or you might use another word which people are familiar with, depending on the context. Which is not here, by the way. Minyan. Minyan is also a number. Okay? But you don't talk about Su'u et Rosh, you don't talk about Pkudim, and over here, even when they use Mispar Shemot. So then, why do we use these different words for the purpose of counting? So the first thing which I'll tell you is that in general the Torah has a very big problem of people being reduced to being a statistic, a number. And then the question is, beyond the numbers, how do you see the person? And here it becomes very significant by the words you use. So now what I want to look at is actually the Ramban on Su'u et Rosh. This is, let me find it. This is not 4, this should be 5. But not the first paragraph, not Kol Yotzei Tzavav, the second, Ba'agadah. Everybody see the paragraph?
Yeah.
It says, Ba'agadah shel Vayikra Rabbah, Doresh Lishvach. They make a drash, which is to the praise, which is, Ein Se'u Ela Lashon Gedula. The word Se'u is a language and expression of greatness. Kemo dichtiv, as it is written in the Pasuk, Yisa Paro et Roshecha, Paro will lift up your head, V'hashivcha al kanecha, and reinstate you to your position. Right? What's this referring to? With Yosef, and it's referring to the Sar HaMashkim, to the butler. Amar HaKadosh Baruch Hu Yisrael, God said to the Jewish people, Natati lachem talui rosh. I gave you a way of hanging your head, but in the sense, hanging your head high. Keshem sheyesh li talui rosh, al kol ba'ei olam, just as my head is raised above all those in the world. Shenemar, lecha Hashem hamamlacha v'hamitnasei lechol l'rosh, af lachem asiti talui rosh. So to you I also gave you something that lifts up your head. Shenemar, suat rosh kol bnei Israel. Okay, now I want to just skip down for 1 second. You see whether it's underlined? V'shum matzati b'mbar Sinai Rabbah she'amru Am Rabbi Pinchas Am Rabbi ma dichtiv b'rosh hasefer suat rosh romem et harosh, lift up the head. Gadel et harosh lo nemar, it doesn't say gadel ela su'u, which means, there are other ways you could say, right, making somebody feel important. Why use the word su'u? Ka'adam shomer lekustinar sav reshe de palan, like someone who says to the executioner, take off the head of so-and-so. Kan nitan remez leMoshe. Here there's a hint given to Moshe. Su'u et rosh, raise their head. She'im yizku, if they merit, yalu ligdula, they will go up in greatness. Kamo dichtiv yisa parot roshecha v'ashivcha al kanecha. V'im lo yizku, but if they don't merit, so it says, where is it? I just lost it. Yamutu kulam, they will all die. Kamo detemar yisa parot roshcha me'alecha v'tala otcha la'etz. As we know, I don't know how many people pay attention to this, but by the butler and the baker, it's fascinating that the word sa et rosh appears by both of them. Except in the case of the butler, it's Pharaoh will lift up your head, reinstate you in your position. In the case of the baker, Pharaoh will lift up your head from off of you. You won't have a head anymore. And you will be hung on the tree. Which therefore means that using the expression sa et rosh, you'll excuse me, is like a double-edged sword. It's like, I am now acknowledging you. I am in effect actually saying, you're important. When I'm counting you, the reason I'm counting you is I love to say, because you count. But you should realize that the minute I'm counting you and you count, that's a responsibility. That's a commitment. And you have this tremendous potential to rise to glory. But the flip side of it is if you don't actualize your commitment, you will die. And in the case we know, unfortunately, all the men above the age of 20 who were counted, in the end, ended up dying in the desert. Because they weren't able to rise to the occasion. When the moment of truth came, right? And they had to now go into the land of Israel after the spies, they didn't do it. So therefore, the first thing that we have is, so what word do I use when I'm counting them? Suat rosh. When you count them, make them realize they're important. Second thing, what do we have? We have b'mispar shemot, the number of names. What does that mean? The number of names.
It's a way of getting around the counting without count.
What?
It's a way of getting around the problem.
It's a way of getting around it.
It's giving them importance and not just a number. As you said, a family name.
Okay, but they have names. These are people when you count them, and in fact, let me just find this. I'm just looking if I have it over here. Could be wait. Okay. B'mispar shemot on the second page. Right, this is number 5. This is the Ramban. It says over there, "Sheyagidu kol echad shmotam bifkodotam bikofer." Okay, that each one would say his name when they're being counted. Okay, kofer is like ransom, but it's like, the idea where you would give like money instead of your, being counted or whatever. The bypass, as was said over here. But now I want you to see the follow-up to this, which is according to the Ramban. You see on number 6 where it's underlined. V'hinei heviu kol ha'ida ish shiklo. Each one brought his shekel because they were counting the number of shkalim, right, to get around as you have in Parshat Kitisa. But now the point which matters, va'amar lifnei Moshe v'hanesiim, and they would actually have a procession which would walk by Moshe and the princes, and va'omer lifnei Moshe v'hanesiim, and they would say, Ani ploni, I am so-and-so, no ladati leploni. I was born to such and such parents. Mimishpachat ploni, from such and such a family. The shehi l'shevet Ruvain, not obviously, whatever tribe you, which means that everyone who is being counted, actually according to the Ramban, by the way, I did an immediate calculation. This is actually impossible. Couldn't have happened because it took 20 days to do the census. 600,000, right? If you assume everyone is coming before, you can make the calculation. I'm not going to go into it now. It's impossible. I mean, you literally have to have everybody maybe going every second or around the clock, 20 days nonstop, okay, for this to have happened. But okay, when I teach, I usually suspend reality for the moment. But in any case, but the point though is very important. Everyone who was being counted actually presented himself and said, I am so-and-so, I come from this family. By the way, it says, Vayityaldu al mishpachotam lebeit avotam. So this is all in the text. And why that? Because you have a name. And it's not just the name that you made. It's from your family. So it's a way of a person realizing, yes, you are important. So I'm just trying to show you how each of these things, the way the census is being done, is highlighting the importance, and here I want to emphasize, of every single individual who's being counted as a way of saying, it's not just we want to know globally how the numbers. No, by the way we're doing it, we want to emphasize, you are important. And that, yes?
In the army, when the soldiers come back from a mitzvah, they do a mitzvah.
Right.
The purpose is to find out who's missing.
Absolutely.
One has to say who his name is so that they can find out who's the one that's missing.
Absolutely. And I'll actually refer to something in 1 minute because it's related to Pekudim. So now the question is, okay, so we got that. Now about the last thing, Pekudim. What's Pekudim? So if you have on the second page, the top, this is the Ramban. It says Tifkedu Otam. So the Ramban says, Inyan Pekida, Zikaron, remembrance, V'hashgacha al davar, and supervision over something. Kalashon, as it says in the Pasuk, V'Hashem pakad et Sarah. Hu pitrono, and this is the meaning, B'chol makom. Lo yimalet mehem ish. They will what? They will not escape from them a person, which means, what does Pekudim mean? As you're being counted as a way of saying, God is now going to be looking after you. Every single individual. Everyone who's being counted is now being brought under the direct supervision of God, so that the idea is, no one will ever be missing in battle. Why? Because God is looking not over the Jewish people globally, but over every single individual. And just to point out, if you look at the reference that I have, at the very last reference, number 8, this is from later on in Bamidbar, chapter 31, when the Jewish people actually go out and wage war against Midian. Right? It's a war of revenge for what Bilam did. When they come back, Moshe goes, the officers, right, who are in charge of the army, come before Moshe and they say to Moshe, Avadecha nasu et rosh anshe hamilchama biyadenu. We just raise the head of each one who is in our midst. V'lo nifkad mimen. So this, and not one of them, is missing. Now, I just want to point out that what appears there in Bamidbar was actually the scenario that should have happened when the Jewish people went to battle. Any battle. With the idea being, when you are now being counted, you are now being brought under the special protection of Hashem, and in the end, what that means is you will go out and you will come back in peace. No one will be missing, because Hashem will see to it that each of you, why? Because you're important, because you count. And it's inconceivable that God will allow you to fall by the wayside. Now I want to take one other thing. Look at number 7, the Sforno. Okay, when it says Vayityal, remember we said the Ramban said that they had to actually present themselves. I am so-and-so from this family, from this tribe. So the Sforno, addressing that pasuk, says, because they're being counted to go out to battle. You wanted to preserve their pedigree, right? Their ancestry, who they came from. Why? That the merit of their parents will aid them. Which means the Sforno is adding another thing. Why are you saying who you are? As a way of saying, you know what, God? Even if I'm not so special, but look at my parents, look at my grandparents, look at where I come from, and on that basis, save me. So I'm just trying to show you that when you combine that, you see that evidently this counting was in order to now show each one you are important. But now I want to bring up one other thing. There's actually a very interesting comment which the Sforno makes on the pasuk Vayihi bin Soah Haaron, which appears in the middle of the book of Bamidbar, and it's a very important pasuk. Now, just so you should realize what you're saying when you sing Vayihi bin Soah Haaron, Kuma Hashem v'yafutzu oivecha v'yanusu misanecha mipanecha. So what are you saying there? Arise, Hashem, v'yafutzu oivecha, may your enemies scatter, v'yanusu misanecha mipanecha, right? Your enemies will flee from before you. So the Sforno on that pasuk says, what's that pasuk saying? And this is connected with what we've been talking about, that the scenario for how the Jews should have waged war is that here are the Jews, right, encamped around the Aron. Now, earlier we said, why are they encamped around the Aron? They're protecting it. No! It's actually the exact opposite. The Aron, which is in the middle, which now has the cloud and has the fire and has the glory of God on it, when they're traveling with that Aron and the people around see the Aron, they're overwhelmed. And that's how the battle should have happened. The Jews didn't actually have to fight. All they had to do was just accompany the Aron, and God would do all the fighting. Which then obviously is why nobody would get hurt, because nobody's interested in engaging them in battle. And that's the way it should have happened. But then you have the question, which is, well, if that's actually how it should have happened, so then why do we need to do the census? And why do we need to get everybody all kind of organized? Here we have the Aron, so who needs everything here? So then what's the whole idea of Yotzei Tzava? So now I want to go back to the beginning Ramban, which is very interesting. When the Ramban, remember he said he was giving you like the summary of the book? So I started with what he says at the end there. But I want to look at the beginning. In the beginning, he relates actually to the beginning of the Parsha, our Parsha, right? And explains why things appear the way they do. So the Ramban says, everybody have it, after we explain all the sacrifices in the third book, Vayikra. So then they began talking about mitzvot related to the Ohel Moed, to the tent of meeting. And they already gave the warnings about not entering the Ohel Moed in impurity. But then he says, V'ata yagbil et hamishkan biyoto bamidbar. But now what we're doing is we're limiting the access to the Mishkan in the desert. And then and by the way, the Ramban, actually, this Ramban, the beginning, is a follow-up, and I'll just say this very, very briefly. I thought I would have more time to go on this. I'm sure everybody's familiar with that. There's a very basic question as to whether the Mishkan was an ideal or whether it was a concession. Whether it was a concession after the golden calf, or whether God all along wanted there to be a Mishkan. Right? And I'm not going to get into the whole discussion, but the Ramban is a big advocate that the Mishkan was supposed to be all along. It was not at all a concession to the Jews to have something concrete, tangible after the golden calf. And the Ramban in Shmot, in Perek Chaf, when the Jews are giving the instructions to the Mishkan, says the purpose of the Mishkan is so that the glory of God should dwell on the Jewish people in the way it did at Mount Sinai. Except that it's not going to be the way it was at Sinai, because in Sinai there was thunder and lightning and it was completely overwhelming. It's going to be in a more muted form that the people can deal with. But it's the idea of somehow taking Sinai and now transplanting it to the Mishkan. And the key of Sinai, which is the presence of God in their midst, to now have that reflected with the Mishkan. In the Vayikra, the Ramban follows up on that and says, and now why do we talk about the sacrifices? Because the sacrifices are there to guarantee that that presence of God doesn't leave us. Because if we sin, so then God says, so you'll go into Galut, I will abandon you. But if we have sacrifices, then when we bring the sacrifices, we can get atonement, and by the atonement, the Shekhinah will remain. And now what he does in the beginning of Bamidbar is the last step, which is what characterized Sinai that God said had restrictions. Who can go up the mountain? And in the beginning of Bamidbar, you'll look at this in our Parsha in chapter 3, it talks about how the Leviim are supposed to guard the Mishkan, to make sure that nobody goes into it. Whoever goes into it who's unauthorized will die, in the same way it says in Mount Sinai. Which means that if I now look at, the Ramban is consistent, if I look at the progression of these things, essentially what we're doing is trying to find a way of transplanting Sinai to the land of Israel. And we do that through the Mishkan. First we have the presence of God which is there, then afterwards we want to make sure it's not going to depart, and then we want to make sure that people know the boundaries, so to speak. And now the last thing is, okay, and so now, why do we have the census? So look at what the Ramban says, at the where it's underlined. He says, Va'akol ma'ala lamikdash, and all of this is for the greatness of the Beit HaMikdash, v'kabod lo, and honor to him being God. Kmo shamru, eino dome palteran shel melech, sheyesh lo shomrim, lepalterin shel melech she'en lo shomrim. There is absolutely no comparison between a palace which has guards around it to a palace which has no guards. So now, according to the Ramban, that part, why are we counting the general population? Why are we arranging them around the Mishkan? What?
Guards?
As guards, but God doesn't need guards, because this is to the glory of God. Because this is a way of saying to the world out there, we have something which is very, very precious, and this is impressive to the world out there, right? And as he says, if you have any kind of site, right, which is guarded, you immediately react and say, well, it must be that because there's something valuable there. If it's not guarded, okay, it's nothing. And so therefore, for the glory of God, we need to now count people. We need to arrange them around so that this is magnifying the glory of God. Now, since if you'll bear with me, do people have to run for or give me another 2 minutes? Okay, so if you bear with me, so now you have a very interesting point over here. And the Ramban actually says this in another reference. I just don't know if I actually gave it to you. I may have forgotten to do it. But let me see. Yeah, I might have. I didn't give it to you. Okay, but you could look this up. I'll tell you the reference. The Ramban actually refers to the camp of the Jewish people. This is later on in the few verses down, as being the Merkava LaShchina, based on a midrash. We are the chariot of the Shechina. And when you think about it, right, just you can imagine this, right? Here are the Jewish people walking through the desert, walking in formation. It's like you have a chariot, which is the Jewish people who are moving, who are now moving the Shechina, and it's as if the Shechina is the throne of God, which is on the Mishkan, and we are now the chariot of God. Now that's really a fascinating concept, because then what comes out is that according to this way of taking it, right, and now I want to go back to the Netziv, right, of, the Pkudim and the Mala Min HaTeva. What's really happening right now? What's happening right now, and remember we spoke about the idea of the Jewish people going from Sinai to the land of Israel? What's happening right now is the movement from Sinai to the land of Israel, essentially, in what I've been trying to show the last minute, is transplanting Sinai to the land of Israel. And of taking the glory of God, which is at Sinai, and now bringing it into the land of Israel. And we have to be the ones who now are the agents to do that. And now I want to just add 2 more points. The first point is, remember we said the soldiers are being counted? I'm sorry, that was a mistake. The men above the age are being counted. We said, why are they being counted? Because they're Yotzei Tzava. What does Yotzei Tzava mean? Soldiers. No. Look at the Ramban, okay? If you look on page, let me find it. Look at the number 5. You see where it says Kol Yotzei Tzava? It says, Kol hayotzim lihikahel ba'idam. All those who are going out to be grouped in the congregation. So the Ramban says, Ki hana'arim lo yikahalu, because the young men, adolescents, don't gather together among the nation. And then he says, Ki kol asefat am, any gathering of a people, tikarei tzava, is called tzava. And look what he says. V'chein litzvot tzava b'avodat ohel moed, yashur mitzvah avodah v'lo yavod. And the one that I think is, for me, very interesting, for those of you familiar with, b'marot hatzovot asher tzavu petach ohel moed. Everybody's familiar with the laver, right, in the Mishkan, was made from the mirrors. The Nashim had, now, unless you're talking about militant feminists, right, who are very violent, why are you calling them tzovot? So the answer is because tzava doesn't mean an army. Tzava means any gathering of a group of people. I would add to what the Ramban said, a gathering with a directed purpose, that's a tzava. And so one proof to that is the women. But another proof is, we said there are 3 censuses in our parsha, 2 of the Leviim, 1 of the The general Jewish population are always called Yotzei Tzava. Look at chapter 4, where it's counting the Leviim. So it says in Perek Dalet, Pasuk Gimel, Mi ben 30 shana v'mala v'yad ben 50 shana kol ba latzava. And you'll see that whenever it refers to the Levi'im, they're called ba latzava. So what do you see? Tzava is not military. Tzava is you're a group with a purpose. The difference between the Levi'im and between the general population, the Leviim are the ones who come in. The general population are the ones who go out. What's the difference? The difference, and now I want to bring up one last thing, you'll excuse me, with the word pikudim. We said pikudim has to do with the idea of God's protection, God's remembrance, supervision. But you have another idea of pikudim, which actually is from the Psukim. Look at chapter 1, Perek Aleph, Pasuk Memtet. It says, Ach et matei Levi lo tifkod, don't count the tribe of Levi, vet rosham lo tisa, don't lift up their head, bitoch b'nei Yisrael, in the midst of the Jewish people. And then it says, Va'ata hafked et haleviim al mishkan ha'edut. What does the word hafked mean? Related to what word in modern Hebrew? Tafkid. Okay? Give them now the role, give them under their supervision the following, which means Pekudim has to do with the idea, I'm not just counting you, I'm not counting you just to be under the aegis of God. When I count you, I'm in effect giving you a role. And the role of the general population, Yotzei Tzava. The role of the Levites is Ba'al Tzava. What's the role of the Levites? It's internal. Their job is to make sure that the Mishkan is functioning the way it's supposed to function. Their job is to make sure that any strangers don't come in and violate it. Their job is to see that everything is happening the way it should be. So there's nothing that will cause God's presence to depart. So that God's presence will always remain inside the Mishkan. What's the job of the Yotzei Tzava? Bring that presence out. Bring that presence out to the world at large. And this is how they complement each other. One is to somehow consolidate the Jewish people from within. The other one is to now bring them out. And therefore, if you now think about it, and I'll end with this, and it's relevant to the Torah reading. This is the real Torah reading for Shavuot. When the Jewish people come to Mount Sinai, there's a very important pasuk where God says to the Jewish people, "Va'atem tihiyuli mamlechet kohanim v'goy kadosh." That's essentially what our role is in the world. What's the difference between mamlechet kohanim and goy kadosh? What's goy kadosh? I can hear.
The people.
What do you mean by the people?
Everybody apart from the Kohanim.
Everybody apart?
The Kohanim.
Yeah. But what does it mean, goy kadosh?
Separate people.
Separate. We're a separate people. And by the way, goy, so for those who don't know, in the Tanakh is actually a very positive word. And it even appears in the Haggadah, we say it. Melamed shayu mitsuyanim sham. Goy means a nation, right, which has significance. You are going to be a goy which is separate, a goy which is transcendent. You are going to be something which is completely apart, above and beyond. But the first thing it says is mamlechet kohanim, a kingdom of priests, which on a certain level is an oxymoron. But it's not. Because by being special, you are a kingdom. You have majesty. But ultimately, all of your majesty is to service the world. You, who have the direct contact with God, and because of that, you have majesty, right? And you bring God's presence into the world, your job is to now bring that radiated out. And therefore, that's why also when it says, right, Ma inyan shmita etzel har Sinai, right? And everybody knows what Rashi says. I think the real answer is the whole purpose of Har Sinai was for the laws of Shemitah, which means the purpose of the revelation at Sinai, the purpose of the covenantal relationship with God, is not so that we should sit in the yeshiva and that we should just, isolate ourselves. The purpose is to bring God into the world And the way that's reflected is how we work the land. And the way that's reflected is how we observe Shemitah and Yovel. How do we create a Jewish society which becomes a model society in every way possible? And in that way, that's the Yotzei Tzava. The Yotzei Tzava have to bring God out to the world at large, so that the glory of God is not just Ve'asuli Mikdash, V'shachanti betocham, and not just betocham, but betoch kol ha'olam kulo. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much.